Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku had Beast Boy's powers from DC Comics, and instead of Izuku being in his own verse he is in the fairy tale verse. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The Great Forest of Eastern Fiori was a place of ancient, undisturbed tranquility. It was a sprawling emerald sea of colossal trees that had stood for centuries, their twisting roots forming natural labyrinths, and their dense canopies blocking out the harshness of the outside world. It was a place where ordinary men did not tread, home to dangerous magical beasts, poisonous flora, and treacherous terrain. For Izuku Midoriya, it was paradise. Deep within the heart of this untamed wilderness, far from the bustling towns, the loud guilds, and the ceaseless, irritating chatter of humanity, the forest was alive with a different kind of sound. It was the rhythmic, deafening boom of displaced air. Boom! A shockwave ripped through a secluded clearing, flattening the tall grass and sending a flock of wild avian beasts scattering into the sky. Boom! In the center of the clearing, a young man with a mess of unruly, dark green hair was engaged in his morning routine. Izuku Midoriya was currently doing one-handed handstand push-ups. This, in itself, was an impressive feat of athleticism, but it was the context that defied all bounds of logic and nature. Balanced precariously on the soles of his upturned feet was a massive, solid granite boulder, easily the size of a two-story inn. It weighed hundreds of tons. Izuku's face was locked in a mask of intense concentration, his emerald eyes narrowed into sharp, almost predatory slits. Sweat beaded on his forehead, rolling down a torso that was sculpted like a marble statue of an ancient war god. 99,998. Izuku muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the wind. He lowered himself until his nose brushed the dirt, the muscles in his solitary supporting arm bulging to impossible proportions. The sheer weight of the boulder threatened to snap his bones and tear his muscle fibers to shreds. In fact, on a microscopic level, it was doing exactly that. But as quickly as the fibers tore under the unimaginable strain, they knit back together, stronger, denser, and thicker. This was his reality. His body possessed a boundless, terrifying regenerative factor. He couldn't tire. He couldn't break, or rather, when he did break, he fixed himself in a fraction of a millisecond. 99,999. He pushed up, the earth beneath his single hand cratering outward from the localized pressure. To the naked eye, Izuku appeared to be a relatively normal human teenager, albeit one with an intensely athletic build and an aura of profound, unapproachable solitude. But humanity was only a fraction of what Izuku Midoriya actually was. 100,000. With a final, explosive burst of strength, Izuku pushed off the ground, launching himself and the massive boulder into the air. He flipped gracefully, landing softly on his feet with nary a sound, despite his density. He looked up at the descending granite mass. He didn't move out of the way. He didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes and breathed in. Enhancement magic, physical augmentation. A brilliant, crackling aura of emerald green lightning erupted from his skin. The air pressure in the clearing instantly spiked, the ambient mana of the forest bowing to the sheer density of his magical output. Enhancement magic was, by standard definition, a support magic used to slightly boost a mage's speed or strength. But Izuku's power was completely boundless. He didn't just boost his strength, he multiplied it to catastrophic levels. He raised his right hand, keeping it entirely in its human form. The boulder, plummeting with enough kinetic force to level a small village, met his open palm. Crack! The boulder didn't crush him. It stopped dead in midair, meeting an immovable object. The force of the impact rippled through Izuku's body and transferred directly into the ground, creating a crater 20 feet deep and 50 feet wide around him. Izuku stood in the epicenter, unharmed, his breathing perfectly steady. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the massive boulder off to the side. It crashed into a nearby cliff face, shattering into thousands of harmless pebbles. Izuku let out a long, slow exhale. The green lightning faded, withdrawing back into his skin. A bit sluggish today, he murmured to himself, cracking his neck. He wiped a stray bead of sweat from his brow, though his body was already cooling down. his heart rate returning to a resting baseline of absolute calm. He hated fighting. He despised the inherent violence of the world, the constant posturing of mages and warriors trying to prove who had the biggest stick or the most destructive spell. But despite his pacifist philosophy, Izuku trained his body and his magic with a maniacal, unrelenting obsession. The world was loud, chaotic, and cruel. To be left alone, one needed the strength to enforce their solitude. If he was weak, people would bother him. If he was weak, he would be drawn into their petty conflicts. By making himself a boundless, untouchable force of nature, he ensured that no one could force him to do anything he didn't want to do. And all he wanted to do was be left in peace. Izuku walked over to a massive oak tree at the edge of his newly formed crater. Resting against the roots was a leather satchel. He opened it with careful, almost reverent hands, and pulled out an ancient, leather-bound tome. The golden lettering on the spine was faded, spelling out the mythological taxonomy of the forgotten continents. His previously harsh, irritated expression softened just a fraction. This was what he truly loved. The quiet rustle of parchment. The smell of aged paper and dried ink. The endless knowledge of the world, consumed in absolute silence. He climbed up the tree with terrifying agility, leaping from branch to branch until he was nestled comfortably in the thick canopy, completely hidden from the ground below. He found a wide, sturdy branch, leaned back against the trunk, and opened the book. For 2 hours there was peace. Izuku read about the physiology of the Leviathan, analyzing the magical theories behind its aquatic breathing and pressure-resistant scales. He mentally mapped out the creature's anatomy, cross-referencing it with his own unique, innate magic. Omniversal shape-shifting. Izuku didn't just study beasts and mythical creatures. He could become them. He could access the genetic and magical blueprints of any living creature, mundane or mythological, and morph his cellular structure to match. He could become a sparrow to ride the winds, a dire wolf to sprint through the snow, or a towering behemoth to crush mountains. Paired with his enhancement magic, which amplified whatever form he took to boundless extremes, he was a living god of the wild. But gods didn't want to be bothered while they were reading. Snap! Izuku's ears twitched. It was a subtle sound miles away, but Izuku's hearing was currently enhanced, passively drawing on the traits of an owl to listen to the forest's ambient symphony. He ignored it. Probably a wild boar. Ha ha! Keep running, little girl. It only makes the hunt more fun. Izuku's grip on his book tightened, his knuckles turning white. The voice was loud, obnoxious, and utterly dripping with ego. It echoed through the forest, disrupting the serene silence that Izuku worked so hard to maintain. Please! Someone help! A second voice, this one high-pitched, terrified, and young. A child. Izuku closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Stay calm. It's not your problem. The forest will sort them out. Do not get involved. If you get involved, you have to talk to people. You think anyone is out here in the deep woods to save you, brat? A third voice chimed in, followed by a chorus of harsh, guttural laughter. We're the Crimson Fang Brotherhood. Our magic is invincible. Once we take you and that weird flying cat back to the boss, we'll be legends. No one disrespects my earth magic. A loud, rumbling explosion echoed through the trees, violently shaking the branch Izuku was sitting on. Dust and displaced leaves rained down from the canopy, a few settling directly onto the pages of his open book. Izuku stared at the dirt on his book. A dark, heavy shadow fell over his face. The peaceful aura surrounding him shattered, replaced instantly by a suffocating, terrifying pressure. His emerald eyes, previously soft and focused, snapped open. The pupils narrowed into vertical, reptilian slits. The irises glowed with a toxic, furious green light. He hated noise. He hated violence. But above all else, in the entire universe, Izuku Midoriya absolutely loathed people who boasted. Egotistical, loud-mouthed bullies who paraded their mediocre power around to terrorize those weaker than them. It struck a nerve deep within his psyche, a trigger for a rage he constantly struggled to suppress. Anger issues. That was what a doctor had called it years ago, before Izuku had abandoned civilization. When pushed, when his peace was violated by the arrogant, a primal, beastly fury took over his mind. Izuku carefully brushed the dirt off his book. He closed it gently, placing it securely inside a hollowed-out knot in the tree trunk. Invincible magic, Izuku whispered to himself, his voice vibrating with a dark, guttural growl that sounded less human and more like a slumbering apex predator waking up. We'll see about that. A mile away, tearing through the dense underbrush, was a young girl with long, dark blue hair. She couldn't have been older than 10. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a small, white, unconscious cat with wings tightly to her chest. Carla, please wake up, Wendy Marvel sobbed, her small legs burning with exhaustion. She tripped over an exposed root, tumbling hard into the dirt and scraping her knees. She scrambled to look back. Crashing through the trees behind her were 5 large, heavily armed men. They wore matching leather armor dyed a gaudy crimson, their faces twisted into sadistic, arrogant grins. The man in the front, a hulking brute with a bald head and a scar over his eye, laughed uproariously as he watched her fall. Ah, the little sky dragon tripped. The bald man mocked, cracking his knuckles. The earth around his fists glowed with a sickly yellow magical aura. I told you, brat. You can't outrun me. My rock crash magic is the strongest in the entire province. I'm practically a wizard saint. Wendy backed away, clutching Carla tighter. She was a dragon slayer, but she was a healer, a support mage. She didn't know how to fight, and Carla had exhausted her magic trying to fly them away from an ambush. They were completely alone in the wilderness. Please, Wendy begged, her voice trembling. We haven't done anything to you. Let us go. Not a chance, a second bandit sneered, twirling a pair of curved daggers. A real, live dragon slayer? The black market will pay a fortune for you. And we're the strongest mages around. We deserve a payday. The leader stepped forward, raising his earth-coated fist. Don't worry, little girl. I'll make sure to knock you out quick. Wouldn't want to damage the merchandise too much. Marvel at the sheer, unbridled power of my... You're being incredibly loud. The voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the arrogant boasting like a razor-sharp blade. It didn't come from in front of them, or behind them. It came from directly above. The bandits froze, looking up. Wendy, trembling on the ground, also cast her eyes upward. Standing on a thin, fragile-looking branch 30 feet in the air was a young man with messy green hair. He wore a simple, sleeveless black tunic and loose dark trousers, barefoot. He was looking down at them with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural green light, were fixed purely on the bandits. He didn't even glance at Wendy. Who the hell are you? The bald leader barked, momentarily startled before his inflated ego reasserted itself. Get down here and bow before the Crimson Fang Brotherhood, forest rat, or I'll crush you into a paste. Izuku didn't move. He just stared at the leader. Crimson Fang Brotherhood, he repeated, his voice deadpan, though the underlying rumble of rage was palpable. You boast about being invincible. You scream at the top of your lungs in a place of quiet. You attack a child to sell her for money. Izuku tilted his head, his reptilian eyes narrowing further. You have an ego the size of a mountain, built on a foundation of absolute garbage. The bandits gaped at him, stunned by the sheer audacity of the insult. The leader's face turned purple with rage. You little punk! The leader roared. You think you can talk down to me? I have the strongest earth magic in the continent. I'll rip that tree out of the ground and beat you to death with it. Try. It was a single word, spoken with a chilling finality. The leader roared, slamming both of his glowing fists into the ground. Rock crash, earth spike. A massive, jagged pillar of solid stone erupted from the earth beneath the tree, shooting upward with terrifying speed, aiming to impale Izuku where he stood. Wendy screamed, covering her eyes. The stone pillar struck the branch. It shattered the wood, continuing its upward trajectory right through the space Izuku occupied. The bandit leader laughed triumphantly. Ha! See? Nobody disrespects my... The laughter died in his throat. The dust cleared. The stone pillar was fully extended, towering 40 feet into the air. But Izuku wasn't impaled on it. Izuku was standing on the very tip of the jagged stone spike, balancing on one foot. He hadn't just dodged it. He had casually stepped onto the attack as it was moving at lethal speeds. His expression hadn't changed. He still looked bored, irritated, and profoundly angry. Was that it? Izuku asked, his voice dripping with venom. Was that the unbridled power you were screaming about so loudly that you ruined my reading session? The bandit leader took a step back, a flicker of genuine fear finally piercing his massive ego. How did you? My turn, Izuku said softly. He stepped off the spike. He didn't fall, he plummeted. In midair, Izuku decided he didn't want to use his full power. These pathetic excuses for mages didn't deserve to see the true extent of his shape shifting, but he wanted them to feel the gap between their delusions and reality. He initiated a partial transformation. As he fell, the skin on his right arm began to rapidly shift. The lean, human muscle mass aggressively expanded, bulging outward with terrifying, explosive growth. Coarse, silver-black fur erupted from the pores, the arm transforming into the massive, tree-trunk-thick limb of a silverback gorilla. But Izuku didn't stop there. He layered his transformations, utilizing a fraction of his chimera abilities. Over the silverback fur, thick, overlapping, obsidian-black dragon scales sprouted, interlocking to form an impenetrable, armored gauntlet. His fingernails elongated into razor-sharp, draconic talons. Enhancement magic, output 5%. Emerald lightning violently exploded around his transformed arm. The air screamed as Izuku descended. He didn't aim for the leader. He aimed for the ground directly in front of him. Izuku hit the earth. His dragon-scaled, gorilla-mass arms slammed into the dirt. There was no sound at first, only a blinding flash of green light. Then, the shockwave hit. It was like a localized meteor strike. The ground buckled and inverted, a massive crater 50 yards wide instantly forming. Trees were uprooted and blown backward by the sheer kinetic force of the impact. The 4 subordinate bandits were caught in the shockwave, their bodies lifted off the ground and thrown like ragdolls through the air, crashing into tree trunks with sickening crunches before falling unconscious to the forest floor. Wendy screamed as the gale-force winds hit her, expecting to be torn apart. But a split second before the shockwave reached her, a blur of green lightning appeared in front of her. Izuku stood between Wendy and the blast, his back to her, absorbing the entirety of the destructive wind with his own body. He didn't budge an inch. His clothes whipped violently in the wind, but his stance was absolute. As the dust began to settle, the clearing was unrecognizable. It looked like a war zone. Only 2 people were left conscious in the crater, Izuku and the bandit leader. The bald man was on his knees, trembling violently. His invincible earth magic aura had shattered completely under the sheer pressure of Izuku's impact. He stared at Izuku, his eyes wide with a primal, instinctual terror. He was looking at a monster. Izuku slowly stood up straight, turning his gaze to the leader. His right arm was still a massive, scaled, furry monstrosity, crackling with green lightning. The sheer heat radiating off the limb was causing the air around it to distort. You! The bandit leader stammered, coughing up a mouthful of blood just from the shockwave's internal pressure. What are you? Izuku slowly walked toward the man, his footsteps silent despite his immense weight. I'm the guy who was trying to read, Izuku replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. The leader panicked. Driven by pure terror, he desperately gathered every ounce of magic he had left. Die, you freak! He shrieked, his ego desperately trying to save his life. He lunged forward, thrusting a dagger coated in jagged, spinning earth magic directly at Izuku's chest. It was a cheap, desperate shot. Izuku didn't dodge. He let the dagger hit him directly over his heart. Clang! The sound was like steel striking a solid anvil. The enchanted dagger shattered into pieces upon making contact with Izuku's plain, human chest. The bandit leader's wrist snapped loudly from the recoil, causing him to scream in agony. Izuku looked down at his shirt. The fabric was torn. Underneath the tear, a minuscule, millimeter-long scratch had formed on his skin. Before the bandit could even process what had happened, the scratch vanished, healing over perfectly in less than a blink of an eye. Boundless durability, backed by boundless regeneration. You ruined my shirt, Izuku noted softly. The anger issues flared. The green light in Izuku's eyes burned like twin suns. Izuku moved. He didn't run. He simply ceased to be in one place and appeared in another. To the bandit leader, it looked like teleportation. Izuku's transformed right arm shot out, his massive, draconic talons wrapping entirely around the bandit's face, lifting the massive man off the ground as easily as one would lift a feather. The bandit screamed into Izuku's palm, thrashing wildly, but he was held in an absolute, inescapable vice grip. Izuku leaned in close, his face inches from the struggling man's ear. You boast about strength, but you prey on children. You scream your name, but you are nothing, Izuku whispered, his voice a terrifying demonic rasp. If I ever hear you or your pathetic brotherhood in my forest again, I won't just break your bones. I will transform into something that will give you nightmares until the day you die. Izuku tightened his grip just a fraction. The bandit let out a muffled shriek of pure agony before his eyes rolled back into his head, passing out from sheer terror and pain. Izuku dropped the unconscious body in the dirt like a discarded piece of trash. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving slightly as he fought to rein in his anger. He closed his eyes, visualizing the calm words of the book he had been reading. Slowly, the green lightning faded, the scales receded, the fur shrank back into his pores, and the massive muscle mass condensed until his right arm looked completely human once more. He let out a long, shaky breath. He hated losing his temper. It was messy, it was loud, and it drew attention. Izuku turned around. Wendy was still sitting on the ground, clutching the white cat, staring at him with wide, tear-filled brown eyes. She was terrified. Of course she was. She had just watched a boy turn his arm into a monster's and casually obliterate 5 grown men. Izuku sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He really didn't want to talk to anyone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glass vial filled with a glowing green liquid, a healing potion he had crafted from rare forest herbs. He tossed it lightly. It landed softly in Wendy's lap. For the scrapes on your knees, Izuku muttered, not making eye contact. He turned to walk away, eager to get back to his tree and his book. Wait! Wendy called out, her voice shaky but brave. Izuku paused, a muscle in his jaw ticking in annoyance. He didn't turn around. Thank you, Wendy stammered, bowing her head deeply. You saved us. I don't know how to repay you. Don't, Izuku replied flatly. I didn't do it to save you. I did it because they were being loud and annoying. Go home, kid. The forest is dangerous. Without another word, Izuku crouched slightly, preparing to enhance his leg muscles and leap away. Clap. 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 The sound of slow, deliberate applause echoed through the destroyed clearing. Izuku froze. His eyes widened. He hadn't sensed anyone else. His all-enhanced hearing hadn't picked up a heartbeat, a footstep, or a breath. Whoever was clapping had been masking their presence completely. Izuku spun around, dropping into a defensive stance, his eyes narrowing into predatory slits once more. Sitting cross-legged on a large, jagged piece of the rock pillar Izuku had shattered earlier was an old man. He was incredibly short, bald on top with a ring of white hair, and sported a thick white mustache. He wore a simple orange jacket with a strange insignia on the back, and a striped hat. He was looking at Izuku with a wide, amused grin. A magnificent display, the old man said, his voice cheerful and entirely unthreatened by the devastation around him. Truly, a magnificent display of control and power. Though, I must say, your bedside manner with the young lady leaves a bit to be desired. Izuku stared at the old man. Despite the man's diminutive size and goofy appearance, Izuku's honed instincts were screaming at him. The man's magical aura was completely suppressed, but Izuku could feel the sheer, unfathomable depth of it pressing against the edges of his senses. This old man was a monster in his own right. Who are you? Izuku demanded, his voice guarded. He prepared to activate a full-body transformation if necessary. And why are you spying on me? Spying? A harsh word, my boy, the old man chuckled, hopping down from the rock. He walked toward Izuku, seemingly ignoring the crater and the unconscious bandits. I was merely taking a stroll, tracking these Crimson Fang ruffians. They've been causing trouble in the neighboring towns. I intended to deal with them myself, but it seems you beat me to the punch. The old man stopped a few feet away, looking up at Izuku with twinkling, perceptive eyes. My name is Makarov Dreyer. I am the master of the Fairy Tale Guild. Izuku's expression remained stony. I don't care about guilds. Take your bandits and leave my forest. Makarov stroked his mustache, unfazed by the hostility. Your forest? A bold claim for a boy so young. Tell me, what is your name? None of your business, Izuku retorted, crossing his arms. He's Izuku. Izuku flinched, turning his head sharply. Wendy had stood up, the healing potion already working its magic on her knees. I am sorry, Wendy squeaked, shrinking under Izuku's fierce glare. I saw a wanted poster for the bandits in town. But there was also a rumor, about a boy in the woods. They call him the Boundless Beast. They said his name was Izuku. Izuku closed his eyes and groaned internally. Rumors. The bane of his existence. Great. Now I have to find a new forest. Makarov laughed, a hearty, booming sound that made Izuku wince. Izuku, eh? A strong name. You have an incredible gift, Izuku. I sensed the magic you used. Shape-shifting, layered with an extraordinarily potent form of enhancement magic. And that physical strength, it is not purely magical. You have trained your body to the absolute limit of biological possibility. Izuku scowled. Are you done analyzing me? I want to go back to reading. Reading? Makarov's eyes lit up with genuine interest. You are a scholar, then? As well as a warrior? I'm not a warrior, Izuku snapped, his temper flaring again. I hate fighting. I only fight when provoked by idiots who won't leave me alone. A pacifist with anger issues and the power of a god, Makarov mused, his smile softening into something more paternal. A dangerous combination, Izuku. Out here, alone in the woods, you are isolating yourself. You are letting that power simmer in solitude. It will consume you eventually. I'm fine alone, Izuku said defensively, taking a step back. I prefer it. Perhaps, Makarov said gently. But a man cannot live entirely in solitude. Even beasts have packs. You hate arrogance, you hate bullies. I saw the way you shielded that child from the blast, even when you claimed not to care. You have a good heart, Izuku, buried under all that irritation. Makarov extended a hand toward the boy. Join fairy tale. Izuku stared at the extended hand as if it were a venomous snake. Are you deaf? I just said I hate guilds. I hate noise. I hate people. Why would I ever join a guild? Makarov chuckled, withdrawing his hand and crossing his arms behind his back. Because, my boy, fairy tale is not just a guild. We are a family. We protect our own. And more importantly, Makarov paused, a sly, knowing grin spreading across his face. We possess the largest, most comprehensive, historically significant magical library in the entire kingdom of Fiori. Ancient texts, mythological bestiaries, lost draconic runes, millions of pages, untouched by the public. Izuku froze, his hostile, defensive posture cracked. His emerald eyes widened a fraction. The absolute fury that had been simmering in his chest vanished, replaced instantly by the ravenous hunger of a scholar. Millions! Izuku whispered, almost unconsciously. Makarov nodded slowly, reeling in the bait. Oh yes. The archives go deep underground. Climate-controlled. Utterly silent. A true sanctuary for a reader. And of course we have massive, private training grounds located in the mountains behind the guild. Completely secluded. You could train without ever seeing another soul if you wished. Izuku's mind raced. His current library consisted of 20 books he had scavenged from ruined towns and traveling merchants. The idea of millions of ancient texts, an endless supply of knowledge to analyze and integrate into his shape-shifting. What's the catch? Izuku asked, his voice narrowing with suspicion. You don't just hand out library access to strangers. The catch, Makarov said, his tone turning serious, is that if you wear the fairy tale mark, you are one of us. You take jobs to earn your keep. And if the guild is threatened, you protect it. But how you choose to live your life within our walls is up to you. If you want to sit in the corner and read, no one will force you to do otherwise. Izuku looked at Makarov. He looked at the unconscious bandits. He looked at Wendy, who was watching the exchange with wide-eyed wonder. He was tired of fighting bandits in the woods. He was tired of his books getting dirty. Izuku let out a long, heavy, defeated sigh. He dragged a hand down his face. If anyone in your guild talks to me while I'm reading, Izuku said, his voice deadly serious, I'm going to throw them through a wall. Makarov threw his head back and laughed loudly. Fair enough, my boy. Fair enough. Though I warn you, our members can be quite spirited. Izuku already regretted this. But the promise of the books was too strong. He needed to know more about the mythological creatures of the world to perfect his fusions. Fine, Izuku grumbled, turning around and walking toward his tree to retrieve his satchel and his book. I'll go to your stupid guild. But I'm taking the quiet way. Makarov smiled warmly. Welcome to Fairy Tale, Izuku Midoriya. I have a feeling things are going to get very interesting. As Izuku climbed the tree, he glanced back down at the crater, the bandits, and the old man. His life of perfect, isolated silence was over. He was walking into the loud, chaotic world of humanity, his fist clenched, a small spark of green lightning dancing across his knuckles. They better have a good soundproof room, Izuku thought grimly, retrieving his book and sliding it safely into his bag. Or so help me, I will turn into a leviathan and flood the entire building. The journey from the deep, untamed forests of Eastern Fiori to the bustling, vibrant city of Magnolia was, in Izuku Midoriya's entirely unvarnished opinion, a prolonged exercise in psychological torture. For the past 3 days, Izuku had walked in almost total silence, his bare feet treading lightly over dirt paths, cobblestone roads, and grassy plains. He stayed several paces behind Makarov Dreyer and the young dragon slayer, Wendy Marvel. Makarov, despite his advanced age, possessed an endless reservoir of cheerful, boisterous energy. He hummed loudly, pointed out landmarks, and regaled Wendy with highly exaggerated tales of his guild's exploits. Wendy, still recovering from the trauma of her near abduction by the Crimson Fang Brotherhood, clung to Makarov's every word, her small white cat, Carla, perched securely in her arms. Izuku, conversely, radiated an aura of profound, unapproachable hostility. He was out of his element. He was out of his forest. And worse, he was approaching civilization. As the sprawling cityscape of Magnolia finally crested over the horizon, a vibrant tapestry of orange-tiled roofs, towering cathedrals, and a massive, winding canal system, Izuku felt a deep, instinctual tightening in his chest. Too many people, his mind supplied, the thought accompanied by a low, barely audible growl that vibrated in his throat. His senses, naturally honed by years of surviving alone in the wilderness and heavily augmented by his omniversal shape-shifting, were an absolute nightmare in populated areas. Even from a mile out, the sheer volume of sensory input was staggering. He could hear the clanking of horse-drawn carriages on stone, the shouts of merchants peddling their wares, the splashing of water in the canals, the cries of seagulls, and the overlapping, chaotic hum of thousands of human voices. To cope, Izuku had to actively suppress his own biology. Walking behind Makarov, he closed his eyes for a brief moment and focused inward. He targeted the intricate structure of his inner ear, drawing upon the genetic blueprint of a subterranean mole, a creature adapted to tune out high-frequency noise and focus only on deep, seismic vibrations. He initiated a microtransformation. Deep within his ear canals, the tiny bones shifted and thickened, effectively dampening the ambient noise of the city down to a dull, manageable hum. Magnificent, isn't it? Makarov called back, pausing at the top of a hill to gesture grandly toward the city. The heart of Fiori magic. And there, right in the center, is our home. Izuku opened his eyes. His gaze bypassed the beautiful architecture and locked onto a massive, multi-story building situated near the edge of the city. It had a large, sweeping roof, a prominent banner bearing a strange, fairy-like insignia, and an aura of chaotic magical energy that was so dense it practically warped the air around it. Even from this distance, Izuku could sense the volatile spikes of ether nano radiating from the building. Fire, ice, iron, esoteric spells of varying frequencies. It was a tempest of undisciplined, raw power. Izuku scowled, his brow furrowing deeply. It looks loud, he stated flatly. Makarov let out a booming laugh, slapping his knee. Oh my boy, you have no idea! But do not fret. A little noise builds character. It reminds you that you are alive. You've spent too much time listening to the wind and the trees. It's time you listen to the heartbeat of humanity. Humanity is annoying, Izuku muttered under his breath, adjusting the strap of his leather satchel. He patted the side of the bag, feeling the reassuring, rectangular shape of his ancient tome. The promise of the fairy tale library was the only thread holding his fragile patience together. If Makarov had lied about the millions of books, Izuku had already mentally calculated the exact amount of kinetic force required to level the Guildhall and walk back to the forest. Come along, children! Makarov cheered, marching down the hill. Let us introduce you to your new family. Wendy offered Izuku a timid, hopeful smile. Izuku looked away, his expression stony. Family? He didn't want a family. He wanted a quiet room, a stack of books, and the complete absence of human interaction. As they navigated the streets of Magnolia, Izuku kept his head down, his posture rigid. The townsfolk parted ways from Makarov, greeting the small old man with deep respect and fond smiles. They cast curious, wary glances at the brooding, muscular teenager trailing behind him. Izuku's aura was intense. Even without activating his enhancement magic, his body was a densely packed weapon of boundless potential. He walked with the silent, predatory grace of an apex predator, his eyes constantly darting, analyzing every alleyway, every rooftop, every potential threat. Finally, they arrived at the courtyard of the Fairy Tale Guild. The building was even larger up close. Massive wooden double doors stood shut, though the noise bleeding through the thick oak was deafening. It sounded less like a gathering of mages and more like a riot in a prison courtyard. Izuku stopped 10 feet from the doors. His mole-adapted ears, even dampened, picked up the sounds of shattering glass, splintering wood, roaring flames, and people screaming insults at the top of their lungs. Master Makarov, Izuku said, his voice cold and perfectly measured. I am going to ask you this once. Are they always like this? Makarov placed his hands on his hips, a proud, goofy smile on his face. Only on days ending in Y, my boy. Now, behold, Makarov didn't bother using his hands to open the doors. He simply stepped forward, and a massive, invisible wave of magical pressure blasted the heavy oak doors inward on their hinges. They slammed against the interior walls with a thunderous crash. Izuku stood at the threshold, his emerald eyes taking in the scene. It was pure, unadulterated pandemonium. The interior of the Guildhall was massive, filled with rows of wooden tables and benches. Or at least, it had been. Currently, most of the furniture was reduced to splintered kindling. In the center of the room, a massive brawl was taking place involving no less than 30 mages. A young man with spiky pink hair was currently suspended in midair, his fists wreathed in roaring crimson flames, screaming something about eating fire. He was aiming a punch at a dark-haired young man who, inexplicably, was completely naked save for his underwear, and whose hands were glowing with absolute zero, freezing mist. Flame brain! The stripped mage roared, creating a massive hammer of solid ice. Ice princess! The pink-haired mage bellowed back, meeting the ice hammer with a flaming fist. The collision sent a shockwave of steam and concussive force through the hall. Caught in the crossfire was a hulking, muscular man with white hair, who simply flexed his massive biceps and roared, "If you're a real man, you take the hit!" A barrel of ale flew through the air, completely missing the combatants, and hurtling directly toward the doorway where Izuku, Makarov, and Wendy stood. Izuku didn't blink. He didn't shift his stance. He simply raised his left hand. Smack! The heavy, oak and iron barrel, traveling at speeds that would have shattered a normal man's skull, stopped dead in Izuku's palm. The wood groaned under the immense kinetic energy, but Izuku's arm didn't give a single millimeter. He held the 100-pound barrel as effortlessly as one might hold an apple. The brawl inside the Guildhall ground to a halt. The mages froze mid-punch, mid-spell, and mid-shout. Every eye turned toward the doorway. They saw their master, standing proudly. They saw a terrified little girl with blue hair, and they saw a young man with messy green hair, an aura of terrifying stillness, casually holding a flying barrel of ale with one hand. "We're back!" Makarov roared, his voice magically amplified to rattle the very foundations of the building. "And we have new recruits! Everyone, clean up this mess instantly. You look like a bunch of rabid baboons." The guild erupted into cheers, completely ignoring the scolding. "Welcome back, Master. Who's the new guy? Look at the muscles on him. Think he wants to arm wrestle?" Izuku lowered the barrel, setting it on the ground with a soft thud. He surveyed the crowd. His analytical mind was already working, categorizing them. Fire mage. High offensive output, low discipline. Ice mage. Good shaping skills, careless with ambient temperature. Takeover mage. Brute strength, predictable. None of them were threats. All of them were annoyances. "Listen up, brats," Makarov shouted, hopping up onto the nearby bar counter. A beautiful young woman with long white hair smiled at him from behind the bar. "This little lady is Wendy Marvel, a sky dragon slayer. Treat her with respect, or I'll crush you." Gasps of "oh" rippled through the crowd. Another dragon slayer? And this? Makarov pointed dramatically at Izuku, who was currently staring at a stain on the floorboards, completely ignoring the grand introduction. "This is Izuku Midoriya. I found him in the eastern forests. He is a mage of extraordinary caliber, and as of today, he is a member of Fairy Tail." Silence hung in the air for a moment. The guild members sized him up. Izuku didn't look at them. He was already scanning the perimeter of the room, looking for the darkest, most isolated corner available. "Hey! New guy!" The voice was loud, raspy, and overflowing with an ego that made Izuku's teeth grind together. The pink-haired mage, Natsu Drangneel, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He marched right up to Izuku, stopping mere inches away. Natsu leaned in, his sharp, draconic nose twitching as he took a deep sniff. Natsu frowned, looking confused. As a dragon slayer, his sense of smell was unparalleled. He could smell a person's magic, their emotions, and their nature. But when he smelled Izuku, it was a chaotic, impossible mess. It smelled like the deep earth, like the ozone of a lightning storm, like the blood of a wolf, the scales of a reptile, and the sterile cold of a mountain peak. It was every beast in the world rolled into one, masking the scent of the human underneath. "You smell weird," Natsu declared, crossing his arms, an arrogant smirk playing on his lips. "Master says you're strong. You don't look that tough to me. I'm Natsu Drangneel, a fire dragon slayer. If you're gonna be in this guild, you gotta prove you're not a weakling. Fight me." Izuku slowly raised his eyes. The vibrant, toxic green of his irises met Natsu's fiery onyx gaze. Izuku hated egotistical people. He hated people who demanded things. He hated loud noises. Natsu Drangneel, in the span of 30 seconds, had managed to embody every single thing Izuku despised about the world. Izuku didn't answer. He simply broke eye contact, stepped around Natsu as if the dragon slayer were a piece of uninteresting furniture, and walked toward the back of the guild hall. "Hey! Don't ignore me!" Natsu yelled, reaching out to grab Izuku's shoulder. Before Natsu's fingers could even brush the fabric of Izuku's tunic, Izuku's body blurred. It wasn't magic. It was pure, unadulterated physical speed. In a fraction of a millisecond, Izuku sidestepped, leaving Natsu to grab empty air. Izuku continued his walk unbothered, until he reached the furthest, darkest corner of the hall. A single, relatively intact wooden table sat there, shrouded in shadows. Izuku pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed his leather satchel on the table. He unbuckled it, pulled out the mythological taxonomy of the Forgotten Continents, opened it to page 412, and began to read. The entire guild stared at him in utter disbelief. No one ignored Natsu Drangneel. Not without getting burned. Natsu's face turned red with indignation. His hands ignited with roaring flames. "Oh, you think you're too good to fight me? I'm gonna roast you, new guy." "Natsu, enough!" A stern, commanding voice cut through the hall. A woman with long scarlet hair, clad in silver armor, stepped forward. Urza Scarlet's presence alone was enough to make the temperature in the room drop. She glared at Natsu, then looked curiously at the brooding boy in the corner. "He clearly does not wish to engage in your childish brawls. Leave him be. He is a guest and a new member." "But Urza," Natsu whined, pointing a flaming finger at Izuku. "He totally dismissed me. He thinks he's stronger than me. I can't let that slide. My pride as a dragon slayer won't allow it." In the corner, Izuku's eye twitched. pride. What a utterly useless, destructive concept. Pride was just another word for ego, a desperate need to validate one's own existence by stepping on others. Izuku didn't look up from his book. He simply spoke, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent hall despite its quiet volume. Your pride is an illusion built on a fragile foundation of insecurities, Izuku stated calmly, turning a page. You demand a fight not because you wish to test your skills, but because you need the validation of victory to stroke your ego. You are loud, you are undisciplined, and you are currently interrupting my reading. Go away, child. I am not interested in playing your games. The guild hall went so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Great Fullbuster, the ice mage, took a step back, his eyes wide. Oh man, he actually said it. Even Urza looked slightly taken aback by the sheer, cold, analytical brutality of the insult. Natsu froze. The flames on his hands flickered and died, replaced by a deep, terrifying crimson aura that enveloped his entire body. His teeth bared in a feral snarl. No one called him a child, and no one insulted his pride. Right, Natsu growled, his voice dropping an octave, the heat radiating from him beginning to scorch the floorboards. You're gonna regret that, you stuck-up bookworm. I'm gonna burn that arrogance right out of you. Natsu, stop! Makarov yelled, suddenly realizing that the situation was escalating far beyond a friendly guild brawl. He had seen the craters Izuku had left in the forest. He had seen the absolute devastation the boy was capable of. Do not provoke him. But Natsu was already moving. He was a creature of instinct and fire, and his instincts told him to crush the disrespect. Natsu lunged forward, closing the distance between the center of the hall and Izuku's dark corner in a second. He pulled his right arm back, a massive, swirling vortex of superheated flames gathering around his fist. The heat was so intense it began to blister the paint on the walls. Fire dragons! Natsu roared, his ego completely overriding his common sense. He aimed directly for Izuku, not intending to kill, but intending to hit hard enough to force the boy to acknowledge him. Iron Fist! Izuku sat perfectly still. He saw the attack coming. To his enhanced perception, Natsu was moving in slow motion. Izuku could see the individual tongues of fire licking the air. He could see the biomechanics of Natsu's punch, the twist of his hips, the flawed footing that sacrificed balance for raw power. Izuku could have dodged. He could have easily shifted his center of gravity, leaned back, and let the flaming fist hit the wall behind him. He could have raised his hand, enhanced his strength, and caught the punch as effortlessly as he had caught the barrel. But Izuku didn't want to fight. If he dodged, Natsu would follow up. If he blocked, it was an engagement. If he sat perfectly still, took the hit, and ignored it, perhaps the idiot would realize how utterly pointless this was and leave him alone. So, Izuku did nothing. He kept his eyes on the page of his book, reading about the skeletal structure of the behemoth. Natsu's flaming fist slammed directly into the side of Izuku's face. Boom! The explosion of fire was massive. A shockwave of superheated air and concussive force blasted through the corner of the guild hall, shattering the nearby windows and sending the remaining intact tables flying. Smoke and ash billowed outward, completely obscuring the dark corner where Izuku sat. Natsu, you idiot! Urza screamed, summoning a sword to her hand, preparing to reprimand the dragon slayer for potentially killing a new recruit. Makarov's eyes were wide with a mixture of horror and anticipation. Natsu landed gracefully on his feet, panting slightly, a triumphant smirk on his face. That'll teach him to ignore me. I held back, but that should be enough to knock some sense into. Natsu's voice died in his throat. The smoke began to clear, blown away by a sudden, unnatural drop in air pressure. The temperature in the guild hall plummeted, a chilling, suffocating dread settling over every mage present. In the corner, the wooden table was reduced to a pile of burning cinders. The chair Izuku was sitting on was completely charred. Izuku was still sitting there. He hadn't moved an inch. His posture was exactly the same. His head was turned slightly to the left from the sheer kinetic impact of the punch, but he wasn't knocked out. He wasn't even bleeding. The right side of his face, where Natsu's superheated fist had struck, was terribly burned. The skin was blackened, charred down to the muscle tissue. The sleeve of his black tunic was completely incinerated, revealing an arm that was similarly scorched. But as the guild watched in absolute, paralyzed horror, the burns began to hiss. It was the sound of cellular mitosis occurring at a microscopic, boundless speed. Plumes of green steam rose from Izuku's charred flesh. Before their very eyes, the black and dead skin sloughed off, turning to ash, and underneath, perfectly smooth, unblemished, tan skin instantly grew to replace it. The muscle tissue knitted together, the nerves reconnected, and within 3 seconds, there was not a single scratch, burn, or mark on Izuku's body. Boundless regeneration. He hadn't even actively used magic. His passive enhancement factor had simply refused to let his cells die. Natsu's jaw dropped. His triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer, uncomprehending shock. What the hell are you? Izuku didn't answer Natsu. He didn't even look at him. Izuku was looking down at his lap. When the fireball had hit, Izuku had protected his body with his passive durability. But he had forgotten one crucial, devastating detail. He hadn't protected the book. Resting in his lap was a pile of gray ash and a single, charred piece of leather binding. The ancient text, the mythological taxonomy of the forgotten continents, the only thing that brought him peace, the only reason he had agreed to come to this loud, obnoxious building, was gone, destroyed in a petty display of childish ego. Something deep within Izuku's mind snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a quiet, terrifying severing of his restraints. The anger issues he fought so hard to control broke free of their cage. Izuku's head slowly turned to face Natsu. The Guildhall collectively gasped. Izuku's face was devoid of all human emotion. It was a mask of cold, predatory wrath. His emerald eyes had changed. The pupils were no longer round. They were thin, vertical slits, like a serpent about to strike. The irises glowed with a toxic, blinding green light, bleeding trails of luminous energy into the air. A sound began to vibrate through the room. It wasn't a spell, and it wasn't a shout. It was a growl. It started deep in Izuku's chest, a low, guttural, rumbling frequency that physically shook the floorboards and rattled the teeth in the mages' skulls. It was the sound of an apex predator that had just been provoked beyond reason. "You burned my book," Izuku whispered. The voice didn't sound human. It sounded like two massive stones grinding together. Natsu took a step back, his instincts screaming at him. The dragon slayer in him, the primal magic that ran through his veins, was suddenly roaring in utter terror. Every cell in Natsu's body was telling him that the thing sitting in the charred chair was not a man, but a monster of boundless, apocalyptic proportions. Hey man, it was just a book, Natsu stammered, raising his hands defensively, trying to ignite his flames again. But for some reason, his magic was stuttering. The sheer, suffocating pressure radiating from Izuku was suppressing the ambient ether nano in the room. Enhancement magic, output 20%. The air around Izuku shattered. A shockwave of emerald lightning erupted from his body, violently pushing the smoke, the debris, and several nearby mages backward. The wooden floor beneath his feet groaned and splintered, unable to handle the sudden, catastrophic increase in mass and kinetic potential. Izuku stood up. He didn't want to kill the idiot. He was still a pacifist at his core. But he needed to send a message. He needed to ensure that no one in this loud, chaotic building ever had the audacity to approach him with an ego again. He initiated a partial transformation. Izuku focused on his legs. Beneath his loose trousers, his human musculature rapidly shifted. The bones lengthened and reshaped themselves into the digitigrade structure of a cheetah, the fastest land mammal in existence. He then layered the transformation, augmenting the cheetah's biology with the magical, muscular density of a mythical springbok, a creature known for its boundless leaping capability. He then flooded those perfectly engineered, chimera-like legs with enhancement magic, multiplying their output by an impossible factor. Izuku didn't run. He didn't even dash. He simply displaced himself. Crack. The sound was like a thunderclap inside the Guildhall. The space where Izuku had been standing instantly cratered, a massive hole blasted entirely through the thick wooden floor, exposing the dirt foundation below. To the eyes of everyone in the room, even Urza, who was renowned for her kinetic vision, Izuku simply vanished. He ceased to exist in the corner. A split second later, a gust of hurricane-force wind tore through the center of the hall, blowing tables aside and knocking several mages off their feet. Natsu stood frozen, his eyes wide, looking at the empty corner where Izuku had been just a microsecond before. Where did he? Natsu started to say. You are a loud, arrogant, destructive child, a cold, demonic voice whispered directly into Natsu's right ear. Natsu's blood ran cold. He slowly, agonizingly turned his head. Izuku was standing directly behind him. The green-haired boy's legs had reverted to their human form almost instantaneously. His slitted, glowing green eyes stared down at Natsu with absolute, unfathomable contempt. Natsu tried to swing wildly, a desperate backhand wreathed in fire. He was far, far too slow. Izuku raised his right hand. He didn't form a fist. He didn't prepare a spell. He simply extended his index finger, and his thumb. He initiated another partial transformation, localized entirely to his right index finger. The skin on the finger hardened, turning a dark, leathery brown. The nail thickened and sharpened, shifting into a dense, unyielding keratin structure. He was mimicking the horn density and muscular twitch fiber of a minotaur, a creature renowned for devastating, singular strikes. He placed the tip of his transformed, enhanced thumb against the tip of his transformed, enhanced index finger. He aimed directly at the center of Natsu's chest. Learn humility, Izuku whispered. He flicked his finger. Boom! The impact sounded like a cannon firing at point-blank range. The sheer kinetic force concentrated into that single, minuscule point of contact was apocalyptic. When Izuku's finger struck Natsu's chest, a visible ring of compressed air exploded outward from the impact zone, shattering every remaining window in the guildhall and blowing the roof tiles clean off the building. Natsu didn't fly. He was launched like a human artillery shell. He broke the sound barrier inside the room. A sonic boom echoed deafeningly as Natsu's body became a blur of motion. He slammed into the back wall of the guildhall. The thick, magically reinforced brick did nothing to slow his momentum. Natsu tore through it like wet tissue paper, leaving a perfect, Natsu-shaped hole. Crash! He flew across the alleyway behind the guild, completely airborne. He slammed into the wall of the neighboring building, a large storage warehouse. Crash! He tore through the front wall of the warehouse, sailed entirely through the interior, and blasted out through the back wall. Crash! Finally, after traveling over 200 yards and destroying 3 solid brick walls, Natsu's momentum began to wane. He skipped across the surface of the Magnolia Canal like a stone, creating massive plumes of water, before finally crashing headfirst into the opposite stone bank. He slumped down, completely motionless, unconscious before he had even broken through the first wall. Inside the fairy tale guildhall, there was silence. It was not the quiet, manageable silence of a library. It was the terrified, breathless, suffocating silence of a graveyard. The dust slowly settled. The sunlight streamed through the massive, gaping hole in the back of the building, illuminating the floating motes of ash. Every single mage, Urza, Grey, Elfman, Kana, Mirajane, and dozens of others, stood frozen like statues. Their eyes were wide, their jaws slack. They looked at the hole in the wall. Then, they slowly, fearfully, turned to look at the center of the room. Izuku stood there, surrounded by the devastation his single finger flick had caused. His right finger had already reverted to its normal, human state. The toxic green glow in his eyes slowly faded, the slitted pupils widening back into perfectly normal, rounded emeralds. The terrifying, demonic aura vanished, replaced once again by the quiet, unapproachable solitude of a young man who just wanted to be left alone. He looked down at his hand, then let out a long, exhausted sigh. He rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. His anger always gave him a headache. He turned around, his bare feet crunching softly on the splintered wood and broken glass. He completely ignored the terrified stares of the guild's strongest mages. He walked directly toward the bar, where Makarov was standing, his jaw practically touching the floor. Izuku stopped in front of the master. He looked at the old man with an expression of deep, profound irritation. He burned my book, Izuku stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Makarov swallowed hard, glancing at the massive hole in his guild, then back to the boy. Why yes. I saw that, my boy. A tragedy. Izuku crossed his arms over his chest. You promised me a library. Millions of books. Untouched by the public. I did, Makarov nodded slowly, sweating profusely. And we have it. Downstairs. Good, Izuku said, turning his head slightly to glare at the rest of the paralyzed guild. The mages flinched collectively. Izuku turned back to Makarov. I am going downstairs. I will find a book on draconic anatomy. Or perhaps ancient flora. If anyone, comes downstairs, speaks to me, looks at me, or makes a loud noise near the door. Izuku didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. The hole in the wall spoke for itself. Izuku picked up his leather satchel, slung it over his shoulder, and walked past the bar, heading for the heavy iron door that led to the basement archives. He pushed the door open, stepped into the cool, dark stairwell, and slammed it shut behind him. The lock clicked into place. For 10 entire minutes, no one in the Fairy Tale Guild moved. They were too afraid to make a sound. Finally, Grey Fullbuster slowly turned his head toward Urza, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. Urza, Grey whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Did he just flick Natsu through 3 buildings? Urza, the renowned Titania, the strongest female mage in Fiori, slowly lowered her sword. She stared at the iron door leading to the basement, a drop of cold sweat rolling down the side of her face. Yes, Grey, Urza replied, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and profound terror. Yes, he did. She sheathed her sword and turned to the rest of the guild. From now on, the basement is strictly off-limits to everyone. If you need a book, you ask the master. No one goes near that boy. No one argued. The lesson had been learned. The quiet place had been ruined, and the monster inside the loner had spoken. In the quiet dark of the basement, surrounded by the smell of ancient paper and absolute silence, Izuku Midoriya finally found peace. He pulled a heavy tome from a dusty shelf, sat cross-legged on the stone floor, and began to read. For the past 8 days, the basement of the Fairy Tale Guildhall had become a sacred, untouchable sanctuary. It was an unwritten rule, established not by Master Makarov, but by the collective, traumatized survival instincts of the guild's members. The heavy iron door behind the bar was not to be approached. It was not to be knocked on. If a guild member accidentally dropped a mug near the bar, they would freeze in absolute terror, staring at the iron door, waiting for a green-haired demon to burst through and flick them into the neighboring town. Natsu Drang Neil, heavily bandaged and currently nursing for cracked ribs, a fractured sternum, and a bruised ego of monumental proportions, sat quietly in the corner of the guild. For the first time in recorded history, the Fire Dragon Slayer was whispering. Beneath their feet, insulated by 10 feet of solid earth and magically reinforced stone, Izuku Midoriya was in paradise. The fairy tale archives were exactly as Makarov had promised. Row upon row of towering oak bookshelves stretched into the gloom, illuminated only by the soft, ambient glow of ever-burning lacrima crystals. The air smelled of dust, dried parchment, and the distinct, metallic tang of ancient magic. It was cool, perfectly climate-controlled to preserve the delicate pages, and above all else, it was entirely, blissfully silent. Izuku sat cross-legged on a large, mahogany reading table in the center of the archive. A massive stack of books, each thicker than a man's forearm, was piled to his left. To his right were the books he had already finished, a stack twice as high. Currently, his emerald eyes were rapidly scanning the pages of a decaying grimoire titled Avian Sovereigns, The Biology of Mythic Skies. Fascinating, Izuku thought, his mind absorbing the dense text with superhuman retention. He wasn't just reading the words. His brain was actively dissecting the anatomical diagrams of legendary beasts, calculating their bone density, magical circuitry, and muscle fiber orientation. He was comparing the aerodynamic structure of a griffin's wing to the elemental conductivity of a thunderbird's plumage. For Izuku, reading wasn't merely a hobby. It was the loading phase of an impossibly lethal weapon. His omniversal shape-shifting allowed him to become anything he could conceptualize. But to achieve maximum efficiency, he needed to understand the biology of what he was turning into. The better he understood the cellular makeup of a beast, the faster he could shift into it, and the more violently he could amplify it with his enhancement magic. He slowly turned a brittle page, a small, rare smile gracing his usually stoic features. The Thunderbird. Capable of generating localized atmospheric pressure drops, essentially manufacturing lightning through the friction of its own metallic feathers. Incredible. If I pair that with my enhancement magic, I could theoretically create an endless, self-sustaining storm cell. Suddenly, the lacrima crystal above him flickered. Izuku paused. A muffled, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the stone ceiling. It was faint. Most humans wouldn't have even noticed it, but Izuku's passive sensory enhancements made it sound like a drum beating next to his ear. Thump. 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 Then, a muffled shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing into the floorboards above. Izuku slowly closed avian sovereigns. The rare, peaceful smile vanished, instantly replaced by a dark, terrifying scowl. His jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck tightened. He had asked for one thing. Silence. Upstairs, the guild was trying its absolute best to be quiet. Elfman had accidentally tripped over a loose floorboard, sending a tray of drinks crashing into Gajiel, who had recently been integrated into the guild. Gajiel, never one to take an insult lightly, had shoved Elfman back. It was a minor scuffle, completely normal by fairy tale standards, but the moment the table shattered, the entire room froze. Makarov, sitting on the bar, went pale. Urza, eating a slice of strawberry cake, stopped with her fork halfway to her mouth. Everyone stared at the floor. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy iron door behind the bar groaned open. The temperature in the guild hall immediately plummeted. A suffocating, heavy pressure leaked out of the stairwell, smelling faintly of ozone and ancient predators. Izuku Midoriya stepped up from the basement. He was wearing his usual simple black trousers and a dark green, sleeveless tunic. His heavily muscled arms hung loosely at his sides. His expression was a mask of cold, unadulterated irritation. His toxic green eyes scanned the frozen guild hall, lingering on Elfman and Gajiel, who were currently stuck in a grappling pose, too terrified to move. "I apologize," Izuku said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I was under the impression that the structural integrity of the floor was sufficient to mask the sounds of your incessant, monkey-like brawling. I was wrong." No one dared to breathe. Gajiel, who had not been present for the flick incident, and had only heard the rumors, sneered. "Who are you calling a monkey, huh? You think just 'cause you're some new hotshot?" Before Gajiel could finish his sentence, Urza was instantly by his side, her hand clamped violently over his mouth. She glared at the Iron Dragon Slayer with a look that promised actual death if he uttered another syllable. Izuku didn't even acknowledge Gajiel's outburst. He simply sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The ambient noise level here is intolerable," Izuku muttered to himself. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of the city, out of the building, and back into nature where the only sounds were the wind and the wildlife. He needed a place to train the new forms he had read about without having to suppress his magic. Without looking at anyone, Izuku walked toward the large request board on the far wall. The sea of mages parted for him instantly, stumbling over themselves to get out of his path. He walked in a straight line, completely uncaring of who was in his way. He arrived at the board and scanned the dozens of pinned flyers. Most of them were mundane. Escort a merchant. Stop a dark guild. Find a lost magical item. Boring. Annoying. Involve talking to people. His eyes drifted to the very top of the board, to the section reserved for S-class or highly dangerous requests. There, pinned beneath the skull and crossbones wax seal, was a worn, weathered piece of parchment. Wanted, the Calamity wyvern of Mount Hakob. Reward, 5 million jewels. Details, a massive, mutated wyvern has claimed the uppermost, frozen peaks of Mount Hakob. It generates localized blizzards and has destroyed 3 S-class scouting parties. Extreme danger. Extreme isolation. Do not engage alone. Izuku's eyes locked onto 2 specific words. Extreme isolation. Mount Hakob was days away. It was freezing, treacherous, and completely devoid of human life. It was perfect. Izuku reached up and ripped the flyer off the board. He didn't take it to Mirajane at the bar to get it officially stamped. He didn't ask for a team. He simply folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and turned toward the shattered front doors of the guild, which had yet to be fully repaired from his first day. Izuku, my boy?" Makarov called out nervously, holding up a hand. That is an incredibly dangerous mission. Even for an S-class mage, the environment alone is lethal. You shouldn't go alone. Perhaps Urza or..." Izuku stopped at the threshold. He didn't turn around. I prefer to be alone, Izuku replied, his tone final. And if anyone follows me, I will consider it a provocation. With a slight flex of his calves, Izuku blurred out of sight, leaving a small gust of wind in his wake. The guild remained silent for another full minute before collectively exhaling. At a table near the back, Urza Scarlet set her fork down. Her expression was deeply troubled. She looked over at Grey Fullbuster, who was staring at the doorway with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He took the Mount Hakob wyvern, Urza murmured, crossing her arms. Alone. Good riddance, Grey shivered, crossing his arms. The guy gives me the creeps. He's like a walking natural disaster that just wants to be left alone in a library. Let him freeze on a mountain. No, Urza said firmly, standing up. Master Makarov brought him into our guild. That makes him our comrade, whether he accepts it or not. But more importantly, his power is unnatural. We have no idea what the limits of his magic are, or if he can even control it when pushed to extremes. If he encounters a beast of that caliber, and loses himself to his anger. Urza remembered the terrifying, demonic aura that had radiated from the boy right before he launched Natsu through Magnolia. It was a power completely devoid of restraint. I am going to follow him, Urza declared, summoning a thick, fur-lined coat over her armor. Are you insane? Grey Whisper yelled, jumping up. Did you not hear what he just said? I will consider it a provocation. Urza, he flicked Natsu through 3 buildings. If you provoke him, he's going to turn you into modern art, which is why I will not engage him, Urza countered rationally. I will observe. I need to understand his magic. I need to see how he fights when he is not holding back against guildmates. If he is truly a danger to Fiori, we need to know his weaknesses. She looked at Grey. You're coming with me. What? Why me? Because Hakob is a frozen wasteland. Your ice-make magic will allow us to traverse the terrain silently and mask our thermal signatures. If anyone can help me track him without being noticed, it is you, Grey groaned, dragging a hand down his face. If we die, I'm haunting you. 2 days later, the landscape of Fiori had shifted from lush, vibrant plains to a jagged, unforgiving expanse of white and gray. Mount Hakob loomed in the distance, a colossal titan of rock and ice that pierced the very clouds. The winds howled like tortured spirits, whipping snow and ice crystals through the air with enough force to flay the skin off an ordinary man. For Urza and Grey, tracking Izuku had been an absolute nightmare. They were currently huddled behind a massive snowbank, shivering despite their heavy winter gear and Grey's innate resistance to the cold. They had maintained a distance of exactly 2 miles from Izuku at all times, relying on Urza's specialized telescopic lacrima binoculars to keep him in sight. They had to be flawlessly stealthy. They masked their scent with pine oil, erased their footprints with Grey's ice magic, and kept their own magical auras suppressed to practically zero. I don't understand, Grey chattered, his teeth clacking together as he peered through the snow. How is he doing that? Through the binoculars, Urza watched Izuku Midoriya. The boy was not wearing a coat. He was not wearing a scarf. He was still wearing the exact same sleeveless black tunic and loose trousers he had worn in the guild. He was walking entirely barefoot through snow that was 3 feet deep and 40 degrees below zero. His magic, Urza breathed, her visible eye widening in sheer disbelief. It's not just a spell he casts. His magic is actively rewriting his biology to survive the elements. She was right. Through the magnified lenses, Urza could see a faint, almost invisible aura of pale blue energy clinging to Izuku's skin. He was utilizing a microscopic partial transformation, drawing on the biological traits of a deep-sea Arctic leviathan. Izuku had thickened his subcutaneous fat layers by a fraction of a millimeter and hyperoxygenated his blood. Paired with a low-output ambient enhancement magic, his body was completely ignoring the lethal temperatures. He looked bored. He's stopping, Grey noted, squinting through the blizzard. Izuku had reached a wide, flat plateau about halfway up the mountain. The blizzard here was intense, a wide-out condition that completely obscured the peak. Izuku stopped walking. He dropped his leather satchel gently onto a nearby rock. He stood in the center of the plateau, closing his eyes. Is the wyvern here? Grey asked nervously, readying an ice-make spell. No, Urza said, adjusting the focus on the binoculars. I don't sense any monstrous magic. Wait. What is he doing? Izuku took a deep breath. The blizzard around him seemed to violently pause, as if the very air was holding its breath. Enhancement magic, physical augmentation. 100% core focus. A blinding, violent pillar of emerald green lightning erupted from Izuku's body, shooting straight up into the stormy sky. The sheer concussive force of his magical release instantly vaporized the snow within a 100-yard radius, creating a massive, perfectly clear circle of dry, exposed bedrock. 2 miles away, Urza and Gray were thrown onto their backs as the displaced shockwave reached them. What the hell was that? Gray yelled over the roaring wind. They scrambled back to the snowbank, peering over the edge. Izuku stood in the center of the cleared rock. He wasn't transforming. He was remaining entirely in his human form. He cracked his knuckles, rolled his neck, and then dropped into a push-up position. He's doing push-ups, Gray said, utterly bewildered. Izuku lowered himself until his chest touched the stone. But he didn't push back up with his arms. He pushed back up by applying pure, enhanced kinetic force into the bedrock. Boom! Izuku launched himself backward into the air, flipping 10 times before landing on his feet. The bedrock where he had done the push-up was completely shattered. A crater 10 feet deep formed entirely by the localized flex of his pectoral and tricep muscles. For the next 2 hours, Urza and Gray watched a display of physical conditioning that defied all laws of reality. They watched Izuku Midoriya shadowbox. But every time he threw a punch, a shockwave of compressed air fired from his fist like a cannonball, blasting massive chunks of ice off the surrounding mountain peaks. He moved with a boundless speed that made him look like a flickering green strobe light. He was pushing his human form to its absolute limit, intentionally tearing his muscle fibers just to let his boundless regeneration knit them back together denser and stronger. There was no ego in his movements. No grandstanding. No shouting of attack names. It was a brutal, silent, methodical process of self-destruction and instantaneous rebirth. He's a machine, Urza whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead despite the freezing temperatures. He's not a mage, Gray. He's a physical anomaly. His magic exists purely to break the limits of his own body. Gray swallowed hard. If he can do that just by punching the air, what happens if he actually hits something trying to kill him? A sudden, deafening roar answered Gray's question. It wasn't Izuku. The sound came from the clouds above the plateau. It was a high-pitched, screeching roar that vibrated with a sickening, chaotic magic. The clouds parted violently. Descending upon the plateau was a nightmare of scales and razor-sharp wings. The Calamity wyvern was massive, easily the size of the fairy tale Guildhall. Its scales were a dark, sickly violet, armored thickly enough to deflect cannon fire. Its wingspan blotted out the meager sunlight, and its long, whip-like tail ended in a cluster of jagged, venomous spikes. The beast landed heavily on the edge of the plateau, the rock groaning under its immense weight. It locked its glowing, reptilian eyes onto the small, green-haired human standing in its territory. The wyvern opened its massive jaws and unleashed a torrent of sub-zero, magical blizzard breath directly at Izuku. Urza tensed, ready to leap from her hiding spot to help. Wait, Gray grabbed her arm, his eyes locked on the plateau. Izuku didn't move. He simply raised his left hand. Enhancement magic, output 5%. Izuku didn't use a spell to counter the breath. He simply swiped his hand in a horizontal arc. The sheer physical force of his enhanced swipe created a vacuum blade of compressed air. The blade met the wyvern's blizzard breath head-on, and cleaved it perfectly in two. The deadly frost harmlessly bypassed Izuku, freezing the rock behind him, leaving him completely untouched in the center. Izuku lowered his hand, staring up at the towering monster. He let out a long, deeply exasperated sigh. Your bone structure is highly inefficient, Izuku stated calmly, his voice easily carrying over the howling winds. Your wingspan is too large for your core muscle mass, meaning your aerial maneuverability relies entirely on ambient wind currents rather than sustained propulsion. You are an evolutionary dead end. The wyvern didn't understand the insult, but it understood the utter lack of fear radiating from the human. Infuriated, the beast roared, lunging forward with jaws wide enough to swallow a carriage whole. Izuku closed his eyes. I came here to test a new form, Izuku murmured to himself. I suppose you'll do for a target dummy. Izuku's eyes snapped open. The toxic green glow ignited, bleeding into the air around him. He didn't want to fight in his human form. He wanted to see if the anatomical theories he had read in the archives were accurate. He wanted to flex the absolute zenith of his shape-shifting capabilities. Omniversal shape-shifting, full transformation. Izuku didn't just shift, he erupted. A blinding, catastrophic pillar of emerald light consumed him. The sound of shifting bone, expanding muscle, and restructuring magic was deafening. The wyvern pulled back, shielding its eyes from the sudden, blinding glare. 2 miles away, Urza and Gray were forced to look away as the sheer density of the magical output threatened to burn their retinas. "What is he doing?" Urza shouted, gripping her sword. His magic power just spiked by a factor of 10,000. The light slowly faded, replaced by a dense, swirling vortex of dark storm clouds that instantly localized directly over the plateau. The ambient temperature, already freezing, suddenly became heavy, suffocating, and charged with static electricity. When the light cleared, Izuku Midoriya was gone. In his place hovered a creature of myth, of legend, and of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a mythical thunderbird, but it was not a bird of flesh and bone. Its massive, majestic body, with a wingspan rivaling the wyvern's, was composed entirely of solidified, crackling emerald lightning and dark, storm-gray metallic feathers. Its talons were jagged bolts of plasma. Its eyes were twin suns of toxic green fury. The thunderbird didn't flap its wings to stay aloft. It floated on an anti-gravity field of its own displaced electromagnetic energy. Screeink! The sound the thunderbird made wasn't a roar. It was the deafening, apocalyptic crack of a thunderbolt striking the earth. The sound wave alone shattered the ice on the surrounding peaks, causing a cascade of mini-avalanches. The Calamity wyvern, an apex predator of the frozen peaks, suddenly looked very, very small. It took a step back, a low whine escaping its throat. Its primal instincts recognized that it had just challenged a god of the sky. Inside the mind of the thunderbird, Izuku was perfectly calm. The biological integration is seamless, Izuku analyzed internally. The metallic plumage acts as a perfect conduit for atmospheric friction. Now, let's see what happens when I apply boundless enhancement to a mythical framework. Enhancement magic, output 50%. The thunderbird's metallic feathers flared outward. The sky broke. The natural blizzard on Mount Hakob was instantly obliterated, replaced by a localized, catastrophic hurricane of emerald lightning and gale-force winds controlled entirely by Izuku. Thousands of lightning bolts rained down from the dark clouds, striking the plateau, superheating the rock and turning the ice into boiling steam. The wyvern shrieked in terror and tried to fly away. Izuku didn't let it. With a single, imperceptible twitch of its massive, lightning-wreathed wings, the thunderbird vanished from its position. It didn't fly. It rode a bolt of its own lightning. The thunderbird appeared directly above the fleeing wyvern. Izuku didn't use a spell. He simply dropped. The thunderbird's massive, plasma-coated talons slammed into the wyvern's back. The impact was meteoric. The wyvern was driven out of the sky, crashing back down onto the plateau with enough force to crack the mountain's foundation. The beast roared in agony as the boundless kinetic force and superheated plasma scorched its supposedly impenetrable scales. Izuku pinned the massive beast to the ground with one talon. The wyvern thrashed wildly, whipping its venomous tail up to strike the thunderbird. Izuku didn't even bother to dodge. The jagged, venomous spikes of the wyvern's tail struck the thunderbird's chest. But instead of piercing flesh, the spikes struck the heavily enhanced, metallic feathers of the mythic beast. Snap! The wyvern's tail shattered upon impact, the spikes breaking off harmlessly. Izuku's boundless durability translated perfectly to his transformed state. He was completely untouchable. Izuku looked down at the thrashing, defeated wyvern. He felt no thrill of victory. He felt no pride. He only felt a clinical, analytical satisfaction that his new transformation worked exactly as intended. He didn't want to kill the beast. He was a pacifist, and the wyvern was just an animal acting on its nature. It had been subdued. That was enough. Izuku opened the thunderbird's massive beak. He didn't fire a blast of lightning. He simply let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated with the threat of absolute annihilation. Submit. The wyvern went completely limp. It pressed its massive head into the shattered rock, whining pitifully, acknowledging the absolute dominance of the creature above it. Izuku released his grip. The Thunderbird lifted off the wyvern, hovering a few dozen feet in the air. The storm clouds above began to dissipate, the emerald lightning drawing back into the creature's metallic feathers. 2 miles away, Urza and Gray were kneeling in the snow, completely paralyzed by what they had just witnessed. He defeated an S-class Calamity beast in less than 10 seconds, Gray whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't even use a spell. He just became something better. A mythical takeover, Urza muttered, her mind racing to categorize the magic. But it's not a soul he consumed. He created that form entirely from his own magic. And the sheer power of it eclipses anything I have ever seen. Makarov was right. We have a god walking among us. Suddenly Urza froze. Through the binoculars, she saw the massive Thunderbird slowly turn its head. The creature was hovering over the defeated wyvern, facing the opposite direction of the snowbank where Urza and Gray were hiding. But as its head turned, its massive, glowing green eyes locked with terrifying, impossible precision perfectly onto Urza's location. Even from 2 miles away, through a blizzard behind a snowbank, with their magic suppressed, he knew. He had known the entire time. The Thunderbird didn't roar. It didn't attack. It simply glared. The sheer intensity of that emerald glare pierced through the distance, striking Urza and Gray with a wave of suffocating, predatory pressure. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a promise. You invaded my silence. Do not follow me again. Urza lowered the binoculars, her hands trembling slightly. He sees us. Before Gray could panic, a blinding flash of green light illuminated the plateau. When Urza raised the binoculars again, the Thunderbird was gone. Standing in its place was Izuku Midoriya, back in his human form, completely unharmed. He calmly walked over to the rock, picked up his leather satchel, slung it over his shoulder, and turned his back on the cowering wyvern. With a single, enhanced leap, Izuku cleared the plateau, rocketing toward the highest, most isolated peaks of the Hakob mountain range, disappearing entirely into the howling blizzard. He was seeking true solitude, a place where not even his annoying guildmates could find him. Gray slumped back into the snow, letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. Okay, message received. We go home now. We tell Makarov the boy is perfectly fine, completely terrifying, and we leave him the hell alone. Urza stood up slowly, brushing the snow off her armor. She looked up at the jagged peaks where Izuku had vanished. Yes, Urza agreed quietly, a profound sense of respect and apprehension settling in her chest. He does not want our companionship. He does not want our rivalry. He only wants to be left alone with his power. She turned away, beginning the long trek back down the mountain. And for the sake of Fiori, Urza murmured, we had better make sure no one ever makes him truly angry again. High above them, amidst the freezing clouds, Izuku Midoriya finally found a cave completely devoid of life. He sat down, pulled a salvaged, slightly singed book from his satchel, and smiled. Finally. Silence. 3 weeks had passed since the incident on Mount Hakob. To the casual observer within the fairy tale guild, those 3 weeks had been an era of unprecedented, anxiety-inducing peace. Urza Scarlet and Grey Fullbuster had returned from the frozen peaks pale, tight-lipped, and radiating an aura of profound trauma. Master Makarov had immediately called a closed-door meeting with his core S-class mages. The details of that meeting were kept strictly classified, but the resulting mandate was broadcast to the entire guild with absolute, unyielding authority. Izuku Midoriya is not to be engaged, provoked, challenged, or annoyed. If he is in the main hall, you will lower your voices. If he is walking toward you, you will step aside. And under absolutely no circumstances is anyone to cross the threshold of the basement archives. When Izuku finally returned from his solitary training in the wilderness, the guild's reaction was immediate and visceral. The heavy oak doors of the guild hall opened with a soft creak. The raucous laughter, the clinking of tankards, the fiery arguments, all of it ceased in less than a second. It was as if someone had cast a massive, area of effect silencing spell over the entire building. Izuku stood in the doorway. He looked exactly the same as he had when he left, barefoot, wearing a simple black tunic and loose trousers, his leather satchel slung securely over his shoulder. A light dusting of unmelted snow clung to his messy green hair, a testament to the sub-zero temperatures he had just casually strolled through. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a greeting. His emerald eyes, cold and analytical, swept over the frozen mages. Natsu Drangneil, fully healed but significantly humbled, physically shrank behind a pillar, actively suppressing his magical aura. Gajeel swallowed hard and looked out a window. Elfman suddenly found the grain of the wooden table incredibly fascinating. Satisfied that the idiots were finally behaving themselves, Izuku walked forward. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He moved with that same silent, predatory grace, his footfalls making absolutely no sound against the floorboards. He bypassed the bar, ignored Makarov's nervous wave, and approached the heavy iron door that led to the basement. He opened it, stepped into the dark stairwell, and pulled the door shut behind him. The heavy iron lock slid into place with a definitive clack. Upstairs, the guild collectively exhaled a breath they had been holding for 2 solid minutes. Downstairs, Izuku closed his eyes and let the cool, musty air of the archives wash over him. The tension in his broad shoulders finally uncoiled. The aggressive, defensive posture he maintained around humanity melted away, leaving only the quiet exhaustion of a scholar returning to his sanctuary. He descended the stone steps, his eyes naturally adjusting to the gloom. The ever-burning lacrima crystals cast a warm, golden hue over the endless rows of towering mahogany bookshelves. The smell of aged paper, dried ink, and dormant magic was intoxicating. Izuku navigated the labyrinthine aisles with practiced ease, heading straight for his designated reading table in the deepest, most isolated corner of the archive. He was already mentally cataloging the books he needed to pull. Draconic scale density comparisons, subterranean insected exoskeletons, and perhaps a text on the neurotoxins of the manticore. He turned the final corner, stepping into his secluded enclave. He stopped dead in his tracks. The protective, hostile aura that had just deactivated violently flared back to life. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone. His eyes narrowed into dangerous, toxic green slits. Someone was sitting at his table. It was a small girl. She had short, untidy blue hair held back by an orange headband. She was wearing a simple orange dress and a pair of reading glasses that were slightly too large for her face. Stacked around her like a protective fortress were dozens of massive, ancient tomes. She had a quill in one hand and a piece of parchment in the other, furiously taking notes from a decaying book titled Linguistic Structures of the Ancient Nervate. Izuku's right hand unconsciously twitched. The skin on his knuckles began to subtly shift, the faint outline of silverback gorilla fur attempting to breach the surface. Someone is in my sanctuary. The thought echoed in his mind, dripping with irritation. Someone is breathing my quiet air. An intruder. Another loud, obnoxious guild member looking for a spell to boost their pathetic ego. Izuku didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply let a fraction, a microscopic fraction, of his predatory aura leak into the room. He took a heavy, deliberate step forward. Thud. The sound was intentional. It was the heavy, ominous footfall of an apex predator announcing its presence to a lesser creature. The girl gasped, dropping her quill. She spun around in her chair, her wide, honey-brown eyes locking onto Izuku's towering, imposing figure in the shadows. Izuku prepared for the inevitable. He prepared for her to puff out her chest. He prepared for her to demand to know who he was. He prepared for her to proudly announce her magical prowess, to brag about her status, to tell him that she had every right to be there. He waited for the ego. Oh! Oh my goodness, I am so sorry! Izuku blinked. The faint gorilla fur on his knuckles receded. Levi McGarden scrambled out of her chair, her cheeks flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. She didn't reach for her magic. She didn't strike a defensive pose. Instead, she frantically began gathering her parchment and her quills, shrinking in on herself to take up as little space as possible. I know this is your spot. Levi stammered, her voice a quiet, genuine whisper of apology. Master Makarov said you liked the archives, and I usually read in the upper library, but there's a specific cross-reference in the Nervate text that I could only find down here, and I didn't think you'd be back so soon. I'm leaving right now, I promise. I won't make another sound. Izuku stood completely still, his analytical mind short-circuiting. There was no ego. There was no boasting. There was only a profound respect for the silence of the room, and a genuine apology for disturbing it. She wasn't terrified of him like the others upstairs. She was just incredibly polite. Izuku looked at her trembling hands as she struggled to hold a stack of heavy books. Then, his eyes drifted to the open text on the table. Linguistic structures of the ancient Nervit. You're misinterpreting the third rune on the left page, Izuku said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, completely devoid of its usual venom. It startled Levi, causing her to freeze with a book halfway to her chest. What? Levi squeaked. Izuku stepped forward, stepping out of the shadows. He towered over her, but he made sure to keep his physical presence completely suppressed. He pointed a scarred, muscular finger at the ancient text. The Nervit civilization utilized a phonemic orthography that was heavily dependent on the ambient mana density of their environment, Izuku explained, his tone shifting from hostile to purely academic. You are translating the symbol for wind as a literal breeze. In the context of the surrounding runic syntax, it actually translates to breath of the mountain, implying a specific, localized atmospheric pressure drop. If you use the literal translation for your solid script magic, the spell will lack kinetic mass. Levi stared at him, her jaw slightly open. She looked from Izuku's stoic face down to the book, then back to Izuku. Slowly, the fear in her eyes vanished, replaced by the brilliant, sparkling light of absolute scholarly fascination. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Oh my God, Levi whispered, dropping her stack of books back onto the table. She leaned over the ancient text, her eyes darting back and forth across the page. You're right. The syntax modifier on the preceding paragraph changes the elemental root. How did you know that? I've been staring at this for 3 hours. Izuku simply unbuckled his leather satchel and set it gently on the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I read it. 4 weeks ago. Levi looked at him with a newfound reverence that had nothing to do with his physical strength. You read the entire Nervit collection? And the subsequent commentaries by the Ishgar scholars, Izuku replied flatly, pulling his own book from his bag. He sat down in the chair opposite hers. He opened his book. He waited. He fully expected her to start asking a million annoying questions. He expected the quiet to shatter. Instead, Levi McGarden simply smiled, a small, warm, grateful smile. She sat back down in her chair, picked up her quill, crossed out a line of text on her parchment, and rewrote it with the new translation. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. She just went back to reading, completely respecting the silence of the sanctuary. For the next 5 hours, the only sounds in the deepest corner of the fairy tale archives were the soft scratching of a quill and the gentle rustle of turning pages. Izuku Midoriya felt a strange, entirely foreign sensation bloom in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't irritation. It was comfort. A routine quickly established itself over the next month. Upstairs, the Fairy Tale Guild continued its chaotic, brawling existence. Downstairs, in the shadowed sanctuary of pages, a quiet alliance was formed. Levi McGarden became the singular exception to Izuku's ironclad no-people rule. She was everything the rest of the guild was not: humble, soft-spoken, fiercely intelligent, and utterly devoid of arrogance. She didn't care that he was the boundless beast. She cared that he was the only other person in the entire city who understood the complexities of pre-draconic magical theory. At first, their interactions were entirely silent. But gradually, the silence evolved into hushed, intense academic discussions. They would sit on the floor surrounded by mountains of open texts, passing notes back and forth, debating the evolutionary divergence of the magical beasts of the Western continent. Izuku found himself actively looking forward to her presence. When he was lost in his anger, the world was a red, violent blur. But when he was discussing theoretical biology with Levi, his mind was sharp, focused, and at peace. It was during one of these deep dive sessions that Levi finally asked the question she had been holding back for weeks. They were sitting at their table. Izuku was reading a particularly heavy, iron-bound grimoire on the regenerative properties of the mythical Hydra. While turning a page, the sharp, rusted edge of the iron binding caught his index finger, slicing a deep cut straight across his knuckle. Levi gasped softly, reaching into her pocket for a handkerchief. Oh! Izuku, you're bleeding. Before she could even pull the cloth out, the blood on Izuku's knuckle hissed. A minuscule wisp of green steam rose from the cut. In the span of half a second, the flesh knitted itself back together perfectly. The blood vanished, reabsorbed or evaporated, leaving absolutely unblemished skin behind. Levi froze, her hand hovering in the air. She blinked, adjusting her glasses. It healed. Izuku didn't look up from his book. Yes, but not with a healing spell, Levi noted, her analytical mind immediately engaging. Wendy's sky dragon magic leaves a residual aura of wind. Poorly Yusuka's potions smell like bitter herbs. That didn't feel like magic being applied to you. That felt like your body simply deciding it wasn't injured anymore. Izuku finally closed his book. He looked at Levi. She wasn't staring at him like he was a monster. She was staring at his hand with the pure, unadulterated curiosity of a scientist who had just witnessed a miracle. Because she had never boasted to him, because she had never demanded anything of him, Izuku decided to give her an answer. It's my enhancement magic, Izuku said quietly, resting his hands on the table. Enhancement? Levi frowned, tapping her chin. But standard enhancement magic just temporarily boosts muscle density or neural response times. It can't accelerate cellular regeneration to that degree without burning through the subject's life force. Standard enhancement magic is a superficial overlay, Izuku explained, his toxic green eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Mages cast it onto their bodies. They treat their bodies as a vessel. I don't. Izuku leaned forward, tracing a complex, invisible biological diagram on the wooden table with his finger. My magic is deeply tied to my omniversal shape-shifting. Because I can alter my DNA to become any creature, I have absolute, conscious control over my cellular structure down to the microscopic level. When I apply enhancement magic, I don't just boost my muscles. I apply a boundless multiplier to my natural cellular mitosis. Levi's eyes widened. You enhance the rate at which your cells divide and replicate? Exactly, Izuku nodded. When I am cut, the damaged cells send a distress signal. My magic intercepts that signal and forces the surrounding healthy cells to undergo mitosis at an impossibly accelerated rate, but it goes further. Normal cellular division degrades the telomeres at the ends of the chromosomes, leading to aging and eventually cellular death. The Hayflick limit, Levi whispered, recognizing the advanced biological concept. Yes, Izuku said, a hint of genuine passion entering his voice. But my enhancement magic coats the telomeres in a dense layer of pure, self-sustaining ether nano. They never degrade. When I am injured, I don't just heal. My body replaces the damaged tissue with completely new, hyperdense, perfectly healthy tissue. It is a cycle of boundless regeneration. Levi was scribbling furiously on her parchment, her mind blown by the sheer scientific impossibility of what he was describing. But the energy cost. To replicate cells that fast, your metabolism would have to consume thousands of calories a second. You should starve to death the moment you use it. The energy doesn't come from my metabolism, Izuku replied, his voice dropping an octave, a shadow passing over his face. It comes from the ambient mana in the atmosphere. My cells are engineered to absorb ether nano directly from the air, convert it into kinetic and biological fuel, and expel the waste as excess heat or concussive force. As long as there is magic in the world, my body will never tire, it will never break, and it will never die. Levi stopped writing. She looked up at the boy sitting across from her. For the first time, she truly understood the terrifying weight of his existence. He wasn't just a strong mage, he was a biologically immortal, boundless engine of destruction, perfectly engineered to be the apex predator of the entire universe. And yet here he was, sitting in a dusty basement, happily reading a book, hiding from the loud people upstairs. That sounds... Levi started, her voice filled with a profound, gentle empathy. Very lonely, Izuku. Izuku's eyes widened slightly. He looked away, staring at the dark rows of bookshelves. No one had ever said that to him. They only saw the beast. They only saw the strength. They never saw the sheer, isolating terror of knowing you could outlive the world. I prefer to be alone, Izuku muttered, though the absolute conviction that usually accompanied those words was noticeably absent. Levi smiled warmly, reaching across the table and gently tapping the cover of his book. Well, I'm glad you let me read with you anyway. Even an apex predator needs someone to discuss nervate syntax with. Izuku looked back at her. The corners of his mouth twitched upward into a microscopic, almost imperceptible smile. Your syntax is still atrocious, McGarden. Hey! I'm getting better. Boom! The tender, quiet moment shattered. The entire guild hall above them convulsed violently. The stone ceiling of the basement cracked, raining dust and debris down onto the mahogany table. The ever-burning lacrima crystals flickered wildly before several of them shattered, plunging the archives into half-darkness. The deafening sound of a massive explosion was immediately followed by the screams of fairy tale mages, the roar of Natsu's flames, and the shattering of the guild's front walls. Izuku didn't flinch. In a fraction of a second, his hands moved with blinding, enhanced speed. He didn't cover his own head. He leaned across the table and threw his body over the ancient, fragile texts, shielding them entirely from the falling dust and stone. Levi shrieked, ducking under the table. Upstairs, the chaos was not a friendly brawl. It was an attack. Fools! Brainless, muscle-bound apes! A voice boomed from above. It was a voice artificially amplified by magic, dripping with a sickening, theatrical arrogance. You dare stand before Vesper the Omniscient? Your pathetic elemental tricks are nothing against the supreme intellect of my spatial void magic. Another massive explosion rocked the foundation. Izuku could hear the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floorboards above. Where are they? Vesper's voice sneered, his tone echoing with absolute, unchecked ego. Where does that doddering fool Makarov hide the ancient grimoires? A guild of filthy brawlers like Fairy Tale does not deserve the knowledge of the ancients. Only a mind as flawless and supreme as mine is worthy of the archives. Beneath the table, Levi trembled. He's after the library. Izuku slowly sat up. He brushed the dust off the books with meticulous, reverent care. His face was completely blank. But beneath the stoic exterior, a terrifying, primal alchemy was occurring. He hated loud noises. He hated people who damaged books. But above all else, his absolute, most violent trigger had just been pulled. Supreme intellect. Brainless apes. Only a mind as flawless as mine. Ego. Pure, unadulterated, boastful ego. Izuku's eyes closed. When they opened, the emerald irises were gone, replaced by glowing pools of toxic, radioactive green. The pupils slitted so violently they almost disappeared. The air in the basement instantly grew suffocatingly heavy, smelling of ozone and the deep, musky scent of a slaughterhouse. Izuku. Levi whispered, peering up from under the table, her breath hitching at the sheer, terrifying pressure radiating from him. Izuku stood up. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed entirely on the heavy iron door leading to the stairs. Stay under the table, Levi, Izuku commanded. His voice wasn't human. It was a dual-layered, demonic rasp that vibrated the very marrow in her bones. Upstairs, heavy footsteps approached the basement door. Ah, the heavy iron lock, Vesper the Omniscient scoffed loudly. How quaint. How primitive. Allow my boundless intellect to show you the true power of spatial rendering. Void cleave. The thick, magically reinforced iron door didn't just break, it ceased to exist. A perfect, circular sphere of spatial magic erased the door and the surrounding stone frame, leaving a gaping, smoking hole at the top of the stairs. A man floated down the stone steps. Vesper was clad in ostentatious, flowing purple robes adorned with gold trim. He wore a high-collared cape and carried a staff topped with a glowing black orb. He sneered, looking down his long, aristocratic nose at the shadowed archives. Magnificent, Vesper breathed, ignoring the dust and the dark. Decades of lost knowledge, wasted on a guild of imbeciles. Now, it belongs to the greatest mind in Fiori. Vesper floated to the bottom of the stairs, stepping into the main aisle. He raised his staff, preparing to cast a mass storage spell to steal the entire collection. He stopped. His spatial awareness pinged. Someone was standing in the shadows at the far end of the archive. Vesper narrowed his eyes, pointing his staff forward. Who goes there? A rat scurrying in the dark? Come out and bow before Vesper the Omniscient, and I may spare your pathetic life. Out of the gloom, Levy McGarden slowly stood up from behind the mahogany table. She was terrified, trembling like a leaf, but she was holding the ancient Nervit text tightly to her chest. She loved this library too. She wasn't going to let an arrogant thief take it without a word. You can't have these, Levy stammered bravely. They belong to Fairy Tale, Vesper laughed. It was a high, mocking, grating sound. A little girl? Holding a Nervit text? You couldn't possibly comprehend a single syllable of that masterpiece. Put it down, child. A mediocre, insignificant mind like yours soils the parchment just by touching it. Levy clutched the book tighter. Vesper sighed theatrically, raising his staff. Very well. If the insect refuses to move, it must be crushed. Spatial lance. A jagged, invisible spear of pure spatial distortion shot from the tip of his staff, rocketing toward Levy's chest at supersonic speed. It was a spell designed to bypass physical armor and perfectly sever the target's internal organs. Levy squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the end. The end never came. Instead, a gust of wind so violent it blew Levy's hair straight back washed over her. Crack. The sound was like a whip snapping next to her ear. Levy slowly opened her eyes. Standing directly in front of her, his back to her, was Izuku Midoriya. His right hand was raised, his palm open. Hovering centimeters from his bare skin was the spatial lance. The invisible spear of distortion was violently drilling against Izuku's hand, trying to sever his flesh. It couldn't. Izuku's boundless durability, enhanced passively, was simply ignoring the spatial tear. Vesper's arrogant smirk faltered. What? Impossible. No physical object can block a spatial distortion. Who are you? Izuku slowly closed his hand. His fingers wrapped around the invisible lance. With a simple, casual flex of his wrist, he shattered the spatial magic like fragile glass. The spell dissolved into harmless motes of black light. Izuku lowered his hand. He tilted his head slightly, his slitted, glowing green eyes piercing through the gloom, locking onto the dark mage. You brought noise into my sanctuary, Izuku whispered, the demonic rasp in his voice causing the remaining lacrima crystals to dim. You attempted to harm my friend, and you have an ego that vastly, catastrophically outweighs your intelligence. Vesper took a step back, a sudden, instinctual chill running down his spine. The boy didn't have a magical aura. He had a presence that felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean, waiting to be crushed by the pressure. Arrogant brat! Vesper shouted, his ego desperately trying to mask his rising fear. You think brute strength can defeat me? I control the very fabric of space. I am a god among men. Izuku's jaw ticked. Ego. Let's test that theory, Izuku growled. Omniversal shape-shifting, chimera fusion. Izuku didn't transform his entire body. He kept his human silhouette, but he drastically, violently altered his biology underneath his clothes. Phase 1. Skeletal and muscular overhaul. He tapped into the genetic blueprint of a mythical lycanthrope. His leg bones cracked and restructured, elongating into a digitigrade stance. The fast-twitch muscle fibers in his thighs and calves multiplied by a factor of 10,000, packing an explosive, terrifying agility into his frame. Phase 2. Dermal plating. He accessed the biology of a white rhinoceros, layering it over his human skin. A microthin, hyperdense layer of keratin and magic-resistant hide formed beneath his epidermis, making him virtually immune to external magical interference. Phase 3. The weapon. This was the masterpiece. Izuku focused entirely on his arms, specifically his elbows and knuckles. He bypassed mammalian biology entirely, and delved into the deep ocean. He replicated the intricate, devastating biomechanics of the Odontodactylus ciliaris, the mantis shrimp. The saddle-shaped spring mechanism in his elbows shifted, locking into place with a sickening click, ready to unleash a strike of unfathomable, catastrophic speed. He flooded the entire chimera structure with enhancement magic, pushing the output to a boundary-breaking 40%. The air in the basement physically warped around him. Green lightning arched from his skin, scorching the stone floor. Vesper panicked. He pointed his staff, his eyes wide with terror. Void annihilation. Erase him. A massive black sphere of pure destruction erupted from the staff, expanding to consume the entire aisle. Izuku vanished. He didn't run. The lycanthrope muscle fibers, enhanced to 40%, allowed him to move at speeds that simply broke the laws of physics. Vesper saw the black sphere hit the far wall. But the green-haired boy wasn't there. Where? Vesper started to turn his head. Too slow, a voice whispered directly into his left ear. Izuku was standing beside him. Vesper shrieked, desperately throwing a spatial shield around his body. Supreme Aegis. Nothing can break. Izuku didn't let him finish the boast. Izuku pulled his right arm back. The mantis shrimp mechanism in his elbow locked, storing an unimaginable amount of kinetic potential energy. Izuku released the lock. He threw a punch. The mechanics of the strike were horrifying. The human equivalent of a mantis shrimp strike is a punch that accelerates so fast it boils the water around it, creating a cavitation bubble that collapses with the heat of the sun. Izuku performed this strike in the air, amplified by Boundless enhancement magic. His fist moved faster than the speed of light. As his knuckles traveled the mere 6 inches toward Vesper's spatial shield, the air in front of his fist was compressed so violently that it ignited into plasma. A blinding flash of pure, localized sonoluminescence illuminated the entire basement. A brief star born in the dark. Crack boom! Izuku's fist struck the unbreakable spatial shield. The shield shattered instantly, the spatial fabric screaming as it was torn apart by pure kinetic dominance. The punch continued its trajectory, burying itself deep into Vesper's chest. The sheer concussive force of the impact didn't just throw Vesper backward. It completely obliterated his equilibrium, shattered every rib in his ribcage, and sent a shockwave of displaced air through his body that ruptured his magical core. Vesper was launched off his feet, rocketing backward at a sickening speed. He slammed into the stone wall beneath the stairs with a force that cracked the entire foundation of the guild. He slumped to the ground, a broken, wheezing, unconscious heap of purple robes and shattered ego. Izuku stood there, his arms still extended. The green lightning was still violently arcing around his body. The air around his fist was literally smoking, smelling of burned ozone. The beast was fully awake. The anger was blinding. One punch wasn't enough. The man had threatened his sanctuary. He had threatened his friend. He needed to be erased. He needed to be broken so thoroughly that his bloodline would remember the fear. Izuku took a slow, heavy step toward Vesper's unconscious body. His claws elongated. The lycanthrope muscles bulged. He raised his hand, preparing to crush the dark mage's skull into the stone. Izuku. The voice was tiny. It was barely a whisper. It was completely overshadowed by the ringing in his ears and the roaring of his own blood. But Izuku heard it. He froze, his hands suspended in the air. He slowly turned his head. Levi had stepped out from behind the table. She wasn't holding a book anymore. She was looking at him. She was looking at the glowing green eyes, the pulsing muscles, the sheer, terrifying monstrosity that he had become. But she wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with a profound, desperate sadness. Izuku, stop, Levi said softly, taking a brave step forward. Please. He's beaten. The books are safe. I'm safe. She reached out, her small, trembling hand lightly touching his massive, heavily muscled bicep. The physical contact sent a jolt through Izuku's system. He looked down at her small hand resting against his chimera-altered flesh. You don't have to be the monster anymore, Levi whispered. You're safe here. The blinding, toxic rage that had consumed Izuku's mind hit a brick wall. The absolute, unyielding calm of her voice acted as an anchor, pulling his consciousness back from the precipice of the beast. Izuku closed his eyes. He took a long, ragged, shuddering breath. Release. The green lightning abruptly vanished. The thick rhinoceros hide melted back into smooth human skin. The lycanthrope muscles condensed, and the mantis shrimp mechanism unlocked and dissolved. Within seconds the terrifying chimera was gone, leaving only Izuku Midoriya, breathing heavily, standing in the ruined archive. He opened his eyes. They were a soft, perfectly normal emerald green. He looked at Levi. She offered him a small, relieved smile. Upstairs, the sounds of battle had ceased. The fairy tale mages had felt the apocalyptic spike of magic from the basement, and the resulting shockwave that had cracked the floor. They were currently clustered around the jagged hole at the top of the stairs, peering down into the gloom with absolute terror. Makarov, Urza, Natsu, and Grace stared down. They saw the unconscious, utterly broken body of Vesper the Omniscient slumped against the wall, and they saw Izuka Midoriya, standing calmly next to Levi McGarden. Izuka looked up at the gaping mages. His expression shifted back to its usual, profound irritation. He reached down, grabbed Vesper by the collar of his ostentatious robes with one hand, and effortlessly hurled the dark mage up the stairs. Vesper's body sailed through the hole, crashing onto the main hall floorboards right at Natsu's feet. He was being loud, Izuka called up, his voice echoing coldly up the stairwell. "Clean up your trash. And fix my door." Before anyone upstairs could utter a single word, Izuka turned away. He walked back to his table, picked up the overturned chair,